All right, I don't know where fuck. I guess there's a folder for Skype that records this stuff. I don't even know.
Ask, hey, ask around. Like every podcast interview I've ever been on, and every podcast, every Skype interview I've ever, conversation I've ever done for like journalism, because I used to be a freelance. Like, it's easy to record. You can ask Max, the This Is Horror guys. Fuck, who else have I been on? The Necronomicon.com. I've been in. So like they all use Brian Keene when he went COVID. I mean, he used to just have guests in the studio.
Right.
But when that shut down, he was like, he did it all through Skype.
Right. Yeah. So we used to play on Skype. Fuck, I don't know, 10 years ago, and then I got super choppy, and it was, the connections weren't great, and the platform wasn't great. So we switched to Google Hangout when that came out. And then that was great. And then, earlier this year, they're like, yeah, we know you guys like that and you use that, but like, we're not going to support that anymore. Like, we can charge you money for meetings and whatever. I'm like, fuck. And, we hadn't used Skype in forever. So it never occurred to me to go back and look at it.
It was weird for a while. I was doing an interview with, hold on. I was going to unplug my Ethernet, but apparently that's not a good idea. Again, weather sucks. I was doing an interview, God, this is 7 years ago, with Craig Spector. He was one of the original Splatterpunks. And that call went on for like 2.5 hours, partially because it was so fucking choppy. And then I had to transcribe the whole fucking thing. That was fun. One interview I did an interview with Joe Hill a few years back for Lit Reactor. And he and I got along famously. We ended up just having a chat, but we chatted for like literally 4 hours.
Oh, nice.
We even took a break so we could both go have dinner, and then came back and called each other back so we could continue talking. The transcript, single space, was 37 pages long.
Holy shit.
And I talked to my editor. This is Josh Saplinski over at Lit Reactor. I was like, So how do you want this? Because I'm originally a journalist, so you write an article. He's like, no, we just do Q&A. So I'm like, okay. Now, I'm an exact transcriber just because it's irritating. I lose my place. So all the half starts and all that stuff that people have in their normal conversation that no one really pays attention to, it was all in there. But even when I cleaned it up, it was still almost 30 pages. So I sent that doc to him, and he was like, this went way long. I'm like, yeah, I know. It's great, isn't it? He's like, can you cut it down a little more? So I cut out this whole discussion we had on being college journalists about, what were we talked about everything. He was telling stories about Kelly Link, what would it be like if Dracula was on BBC, which they ended up doing, which was amazing. And even then, they had to break the article up into 2 different entries, because it just ran so fucking long.
Right. Yeah, I've had a couple go like that. You just, you gel with somebody, and we'll get off and, you stop recording, and then like just talk about random, like whatever. And then it just goes on. I'm like, oh shit. Like, wow, we should probably go. Right. Like it's been 3 hours.
Yeah. I've had a few like that. My wife, because I always tend to do, like, I have a finished basement. So like I have my bookcases down here. My kid has her art stuff down there. And so, but this is where it's just the quietest in the house. There are no dogs, but dogs don't typically come down here. And my wife will periodically come down, like, are you done yet? I'm like, no, still going. And this book, more than any other book, I've been doing an actual promo tour on, just because we couldn't go do any cons. So Max really stepped up and was like, here's what you do. And I was like, holy shit. All right, let's do it. So every other night, my wife's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm going to go do an interview. She was like, again? I was like, apparently people are interested about
living the dream. Yeah. Cool. So do you want to start over again?
We can do whatever. I'm pretty I'm pretty easygoing. Whatever works best for you, like, because you have your own kind of thing, man. I'm just glad to be along.
Well, so I'll probably I'll probably edit this in at some point,
Okay.
or throw it on the back end or whatever, because it is, still relevant to sort of what's going on.
Sure.
But yeah. So if you wanna intro us again, I'll intro the show, and then we'll pick up as if none of this had ever happened.
Give me 1 second. Let me go grab my coffee from the other room, and then
Sure.
let's do that.
Yep.
Give me like a 45-second count.
Yep.
I don't move like a 20-year-old. All right. Hey, my toothpick. Hey, a plug, because that might be relevant. Let's plug you in just so you're all charged there. Yes. Okay. Okay. Ugh. And I am back, good sir.
I am here.
I would hope. All right, so you want me to do the same thing over again? You want me to do the bumper again?
Yeah.
All right. Hi, this is Paul Anderson, the author of Bones Made to be Broken, How We Broke, and the upcoming novella Standalone, and you're listening to The Legends of Tabletop.
Hey everybody! I want to thank everybody for checking this out. I want to thank Paul for coming in and hanging out with us today and talking about his book.
It is a book.
Well, before we get
print,
yeah. Before we get to that, how are you doing? Are people healthy at home? How have things been for you during this upheaval that we've been experiencing?
my wife kind of laughs. She's like, you're a homebody. And I used to really like fight that distinction. And then in the past 6 months, I was like, oh yeah, I really am. And I have always been kind of a homebody. Not that I don't mind going out and stuff like that. Like I used to go out to shows and stuff. And I am fairly social with my little circle, but I've never had a problem with just like, I'm going to hang out and read. So when everything came down, it wasn't a big deal to be like, oh, I'm in my house. I like my house. I put my stuff there. But it was at my day job's a teacher. So that was a bit of a transition, let's say. Everyone's fine. My wife is an essential worker. She works in food production, meat plant, organic plant. My wife's a vegan, though. That's what's funny. But she's really good at her job, oddly enough. But the real concern, obviously, is like I have a 9-year-old. Well, she's 9 now. So, that was some socialization we had to figure out, and to be safe and things like that. I ended up utilizing, you remember back like in the 90s when they would charge you minutes for like using Sprint before cell phones they would just charge you like anytime minutes on your landline.
Yep.
Like if they did that with fucking internet, like I would have made every employee of say CenturyLink probably Jeff Bezos rich. Because we were just on it. She was, Skyping with her friends, trying to keep vaguely social because hanging out with me is not the same as socializing.
Right.
But other than that, man, it's going.
Well, that's good. I'm sort of in the same boat in that, if I'm not, at the gym or, whatever, like I'm probably home because I'm either playing a game, editing a game, watching hockey's back on or, before COVID, hockey stuff. So like I'm hanging around. It hasn't been like a really big change for me either, which is a blessing and a curse, I guess. I mean, I'm still working, which I'm thankful for. And, but I got to go in. So like there's, risks associated with that and whatever, but
yeah,
we're keeping on, like what else can you do,
I have no idea. And that's why like hobbies are such a big thing. Like tabletop gaming, I said this to you privately, is I have no real experience with, but it is its own industry. And as I've gotten older and it kind of permeates all different kinds of genres. So as I've gotten more into my industry, almost everyone I know plays tabletop games. And not that I've had anything against it ever. It's just I was never my thing. But I hadn't seen it since the 80s. My brother was he was old school D&D.
Right.
And then like when he grew up and moved away and I never kind of picked up on it, I just like, oh, it's there. And then in the past 3 or 4 years, I've kind of become aware of how big the culture is. It's massive. So yeah, a hobby or something like that, or, you know, an interest like that, it's definitely been a saving grace, I imagine, for a lot of people. Because if you had nothing but maybe surfing Netflix, how fucking I would hate the retrospection that would come about when you have no other interest than watching, you know, rewatching House on Netflix. That was your big thing, because the rest of your life was busy being out there in the world.
Doing stuff.
Your interior life was a little lacking. I'm not saying that it comes off really snotty, I think. I'm probably sounding snotty, and I don't mean to sound snotty. But so if nothing else, like having interests like tabletop gaming or in the horror genre, it's like we have something to hang on to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was it? I mean, your brother played. What was it that like didn't capture your attention at that time? It just didn't really grab you at all, or there wasn't any like one particular thing where you're like, nah, I'm
First thing is he's 9 years older than me, so I came at the end of a marriage. I was a year after I was born. My mom was out, and she took me with her. So there was that age gap. So my experience would be like we'd be living after my mom left my dad, and my brother and I took turns visiting each other's parents because he lived with my dad, I lived with my mom. When he would be with my mom, like on Saturday nights, he would leave the apartment. I'm like, where's Philip going? And she'd be like, he's with Ray and Jerry. Or Ray, what the fuck was the other kid's name? It doesn't matter. It's 34 years ago. And one time I remember they were playing our apartment building. It was like 4 stories, and it had like the old school kind of stairwells. And the basement stairwell, which led to the storage containers for everyone, he would be playing with his friend Rob, and I think Rich. I think that's his name. And that was like, oh, okay, that's what my brother does. So that was literally my only experience. For me, and it sounds, especially in 2020, it sounds so weird. I'm not a gamer on any level. I play board games with my daughter occasionally, and I have an Xbox 360, but like I have 2 games. For me, it never just caught my eye, and not on any level, like beyond playing, Monopoly with my kid, or when I was a kid playing Clue with my mom. I just never played games. I wasn't, and that it's not that I was like a big jock. I'm so far from a jock. I played soccer poorly, very poorly. It was never something that was like that thing that catches your eye. And it's not that I miss it, but I'll hear like my co-writer on a book I wrote, How We Broke, Bracken MacLeod. He's into tabletop gaming, I've since discovered. And he'll post pictures occasionally on social media of various games he's into or he's heard about. I'm like, that actually looks interesting. But the idea of the process of developing all the characters and how it all works, I'm like, I'm gonna go read a Neil Gaiman book, or I'm gonna go play a Tom Petty song on my guitar or something. It's just my head just kind of skews the other way. Even with video games, I'll sit there, I'll put one. I'm like, I haven't played. What's one of the games I have? Jesus Christ, Wolfenstein: The New World Order, like whatever the one is on Xbox 360. And I'll be like, I want to play this. And 15 minutes later, I'm like, I am done playing this. It's just like it seems to me like a completely different mindset, and that's really cool because it seems like it's its own world. Whereas most other interests, whether it be music or reading or writing or the other arts, it's a world that is very permeable. Whereas tabletop gaming itself seems very contained. It has almost its own biosphere kind of thing.
Kind of, sort of, yeah.
And you can enter into it. It's not like there are border guards or stuff like that, but it's very much chugging along on its own thing, and it doesn't really need the oxygen of new people to survive, if that makes sense to me as an outsider.
Yes and no. I mean, you have the old guard that still plays. Some still play the old, OSR stuff. But with fifth edition, you see, and with the advent of stuff like Critical Role, you're seeing a lot of new people get into the hobby, and they're bringing a lot of new ideas, new outlooks. There's a big hubbub right now on Twitter. I don't remember what her name is or what her Twitter handle is, but there was discussion about people with handicaps, having a wheelchair, a combat wheelchair in D&D, and like, oh, you can't have that, blah blah. So like you do need that new influx of people to come in and challenge, some of these preconceived, like, oh, you can only do it this way. Well, no, it doesn't. You can do it any way you want to do it. That's not. You need to be outside of the box. Just
of course.
Yeah. So,
oh yeah. And that's a very true statement. It makes complete sense to me. It's like if you didn't have new blood in other arts and other interests, it would be just a repetition of what's come before. So that makes complete sense.
Yeah, I have to go back and throw a link in the show notes for that now. While I'm thinking about it later, I'll have to do that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned you're throwing some terms out there. I'm like, wait a minute, what's that? What's that? Critical Role? I have no idea what that is. But OSR, I know because of comic books. Because they used to, back in the 80s, used to advertise OSR game books, it wasn't until I started recollecting my old childhood comic books that I realized what those were. Because when I was a kid, I'd look at them and be like, "What are these weird advertisements? This isn't for Bubble Yum." And now I think the pictures are cool, but I would have no context of what they were. And now I'm an adult. I'm like, "Oh, that's a role-playing game. Okay."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Critical Roles. So it's the D&D, sort of flagship podcast and stream.
Okay.
They've got a bunch of voice actors and industry people inside doing it. They're huge on Twitch. They had a Kickstarter made like, I think it was like $12 million to make like an animated feature based on campaign that they were running. They have their own book out, published by Wizards of the Coast, and they're huge. I mean, it's a huge thing, and it's a mixed bag, right? So like for someone like us who's a small streamer, it's like, oh well, fuck, that kind of sucks. But it does bring new eyes and does bring new people into the hobby. So that overall is definitely a good thing.
But that's kind of my point. It's like it has this huge, it's almost its own dimension that all this stuff, I didn't hear any of this. And it's like $12 million. That's a chunk of change right there.
Yeah.
Whereas like even in something that you would think is kind of separate or separate from mainstream life, for lack of a better term. That's not the real term I want. Like the art world. Everyone's heard of, though, that prick who made the kidney bean art sculpture and thing in Texas and then bought the type of paint that, is so it absorbs all light. Why? Because of Tumblr and shit like that. It permeates into social media. Whereas I'm like, what? They make what? 12? What?
Yeah.
I didn't know Kickstarter could go that high.
Yeah.
Which probably makes me sound like such a fucking peasant, but I'm not a gamer.
Yeah. There have been some pretty big Kickstarters for gaming. The John Wick 7C, I think, was one of the biggest. I don't know that it was the biggest, but it was one of the biggest Kickstarters for an RPG, and it was 2.1 million or something like that, or 1.2 million. It was a couple of years ago. It was big, for a new edition. Like, wow, that's crazy.
That is.
And he's a super nice guy too. He's here in Arizona. He lives up in Phoenix. I've met him, a handful of times. We've got a really nice convention in Tucson called RingCon, and all the local guys come down. So, fuck him and Shane Hensley, who does Deadlands, which is a Savage World system. Board game designers and stuff all come down. So it's a really, really nice community here in Arizona. I'm really lucky out here as far as that stuff goes.
I mean, it was, like I said, when I started getting into the industry is when of horror fiction or writing, freelance writing that I realized that gaming hadn't kind of disappeared in the 80s with my brother. It was very much first time I ever heard of Gen Con was, I think, 2010. And I was like,
oh, wow.
there's a whole convention just to games? Like, really? Like, not video games, but like tabletop games? Because again, I'm not much of a gamer in any sense of the word. And my friends, and this was a writing group I was in for a few years, they kind of looked at me like, are you damaged? Like, what is wrong? I'm like, I don't know. I played Sonic the Hedgehog until I was in college.
Yeah, yeah.
Not that I have anything against it. It's just like, wow, that's fascinating to me because it's so different than what I had. You know, kind of opened up the perimeters a little bit. And I was like, oh, my horizons have been expanded.
And it's interesting too as a writer, right? Because the coolest thing about, you know, playing games is dice rolling is fun and whatever, but it's telling really fun or dramatic or whatever, but like these cooperative stories,
Yeah.
which, like, you know, you think as a writer to be like, oh yeah, like I want to, like, you know, get into that and sort of like, you know, play in that space. But you don't. It's just really weird.
I know, and I know some really great writers who've worked in both. I don't know if he's worked in tabletop games, but I know he's worked in video games. Cameron Suey. He's a really great writer. He worked on one of the Tomb Raider video games. And I don't know if he's done tabletop. I think he might have. I'm not sure. And because, yeah, the story set up, I mean, tabletop kind of has video games beat with that. They've been doing expanded mythologies and world building for decades. Mm-hmm. But it's like, oh, wow. But again, I'm like, I can't. It's like math with me. Like, I'm like, wait, how? It's so bizarre that I find myself wondering, it's like, why don't I get it?
Yeah.
But well, I don't. I find it fascinating, but I don't.
Yeah. I tried to go back and play second edition, you know, after a long pause, and, you know, they had to hit armor class zeros, you know, THACO. And, you know, we started doing it. I don't know if it was the GM or if it was just like the mindset. I'm like, I don't understand what the fuck is happening right now. Like, this makes no sense to me.
It's funny because I remember my daughter loves Teen Titans. This is kind of a roundabout anecdote. My daughter loves Teen Titans Go. And I love Teen Titans Go because it's so fucking ridiculous because I read the comics when I was a kid. And I was rewatching an episode with her this morning while she was eating her breakfast. And it was the one where they get pulled into a tabletop game. Oh, and nice. Robin's really into it. And no one else understands what's going on. They all just want to ride a dragon. And I am literally Beast Boy in that episode because I have no idea what's going on. And I'm just like, I want to be that guy. What? I don't know why. Why? I just want to ride the dragon.
Yeah, that's cool. I never got into that one. I watched the original Teen Titans when it first came out.
Yeah.
And then like it got kind of weird, and I was like, this is probably not for me.
My daughter borrowed like a DVD season from the library of the original one. She liked it as well. She likes them both. So when they recently did one where it was the original Teen Titans, the one from 2003 versus Teen Titans Go. Mm-hmm. And her and I were both excited to watch it. My wife was like, what is wrong with you two? I'm like, but this is hilarious. And I can explain who these characters are to my daughter.
Yeah. That's cool.
Nightwing. His real name's Dick Grayson.
So are you young enough to have missed out on the Batman in the animated series?
No, I'm 36, so I was right there.
Okay. All right.
I started, actually, it was Batman the Animated Series and X-Men that got me into comic books. I mean, I only got into comic books for a little bit. I moved around a lot as a kid. I think that also might have had something to do with the fact that games just don't hold my interest because we were too busy moving all the time.
Yeah.
But no, it was like Batman the Animated Series and the X-Men the Animated Series. The Fox Saturday Morning back in the early 90s, 92, 95. Yep. Man, that was my jam.
Animaniacs.
I got my daughter in Animaniacs. My wife was like, what is wrong with you? Nothing is wrong with me. This is amazing. They have a Prince anal fingering joke. Come on.
I don't remember that, but I'll take your word. I wouldn't be surprised.
There was an they're going to solve a mystery on a cruise ship. And Yakko goes, search for Prince. And so Wacko does something, and then Dot shows up, and she's literally carrying Prince in her arms. I found Prince! And Yakko goes to her and says, no, fingerprints. And there's a beat where she looks at the camera and she goes, I don't think so, and tosses them over. And that was a joke in a cartoon aimed at children.
Yeah. Well, so it's almost a throwback to like the old cartoons like Bugs Bunny and all that stuff. I mean, they had the wackety schmackety do kind of like physical comedy and stuff, but they were not written for kids.
No, they had a Mice and Men alluded to in one of them, and I'm like, oh no, don't go look at the rabbits, George. And it's funny, I watch them now as an adult, and now because my mom used to enjoy watching cartoons with me. She would, she worked all the time, but Saturday mornings, if she got up early enough, she would come downstairs and I'd have my cartoons on. She'd sit there and watch. She'd start laughing at shit that I wouldn't understand. Mm-hmm. And she would be like, how is that in there? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know what that is. What is that? She'd be like, I'll tell you when you're older. And she never did. So I had to figure it out on my own. I was a latchkey kid. But no, I am of the age where like Batman the Animated Series, X-Men, and stuff like that. That was the first time I ever really got into anything fan based. It's like, oh, comic books. I moved around a ton, so like whatever comic books I had, I wasn't a collector. Like that was the '90s comic boom. I was just reading because I liked the stories. But I lost them all because you move a dozen times before you're 16 years old. You're not holding on to a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But I've recently, in the past few years, I've been rebuilding my collection, and I've actually expanded it. Like all those issues I wasn't allowed to get because my mom didn't have the cash that week. I was like, oh, I can buy this now. And it's cheap because the comics in the 90s are worthless.
Yeah, I know it.
And I know, right? And I found it was because Batman the Animated Series premiered in, I think, 92. And so right around that time, and that was right around the time Batman Returns came out, because that came out in the summer of 92, which is weird because the story takes place in fucking Christmas. And this is back in the day when comic books used to be at grocery stores, which I still miss. I love comic stores, but there's something about going to a grocery store and seeing the spinner rack. That was amazing. And there was a Batman issue. It was the first comic I ever owned. And I lost it, of course, because this is late 91, early 92, so I was like 7 or 8, maybe going on 9. And I recently found it, and I found such joy in it. And I even called my mom, like, I found the first comic I ever owned. And she was like, so? I was like, fuck you, Mom. This is why I don't dedicate a book to you.
Right. No, that's really cool to be able to reach back and find that and, be able to experience that wonder again.
It's a double-edged sword because too many people, I think, get way too into. You were talking earlier in terms of gaming, like there's a big thing about, well, what about a battle-ready wheelchair? In a game, there are people poo-pooing the idea because it's not the way it's always been done. And I think nostalgia plays a big part in that too. It's like, well, yeah, what was great because it's your childhood, but there's stuff that's great now. I recently got back into comics, not because they suddenly interested me more just by looking at them, but a friend of mine, his name's Lonnie Nadler, he started writing for X-Men. And I was like, that's fucking amazing.
That's cool.
So I picked up an issue, and I was like, where have I been for 25 years? And I read comics again. And my wife's very sympathetic because I'm like, hey, I don't have a gambling addiction, I guess. It's better than that. Buy $20 worth of comic books, better than $500 worth of scratchies. And it's, but the comics I read now don't take me back to my childhood. I've kind of filled out my childhood collection. But I always kind of feel that worry. I'm like, am I dwelling? Am I dwelling a little bit?
But you know what? I think that kind of speaks to the cultural sort of, that's not a valid thing. Like that's a kid thing. Like there's no intrinsic value in, a comic book or a game or whatever. And that's such bullshit because there's so much effort and expertise that goes into that stuff, and great stories that are being told, that has its own value.
And I completely agree with that. I do think there are people who hold on to the past instead of using it to build towards the future. And I always kind of worry, like, because like I said, my childhood it wasn't a bad childhood, but it was tumultuous. So like comic books were a safe haven for me. When I got older, it was like horror novels were a safe haven for me. Movies were a safe haven for me. Punk rock was a big safe haven for me when I hit puberty. Thank Christ I discovered punk rock. But there are people who kind of latch onto it and don't let that progress. I do agree. There are people who kind of poo-poo nostalgia at all costs because they do kind of see it as a kiddie thing, which I reject out of hand because, again, like you just said, like these people are artists, they're writers, they're creators, they are building something. Even if it's just to entertain, but there's nothing better in telling a story that's entertaining. Yeah, you can throw a little message at them if you want, but if they don't even get the message and they're just enjoying the story, they enjoy the story. Let them have it. So no, I do agree with that, but I do think there are some people who kind of hold on and don't allow that to progress. Like I said, those, like you were mentioning, Tabletop King, those people are like, what? We've never had battle ready, like accessibility for wheelchairs. That can't happen. Why not? Well, we've never done it. So
yeah, means it can't be done.
Yeah, exactly. But that drives a lot. That's not just nostalgia. That's the way it's always been done, or this way it's always been viewed. Plus, you can always take it the other way. Like, I don't know where you fall on the whole Zack Snyder Superman's thing, but I do tend to think, I'm like, dude, you're trying way too hard to justify liking a man who wears his underwear on the outside. It's Superman. He's not the Punisher.
Well, and that was I didn't see it, but if you try to make Superman a darker hero than Batman, you probably don't understand the character. Like,
yeah, that's kind of it. And Superman and Batman can only be so dark before it's just like it's like parody.
Yeah.
Like, I love Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, in spite of the fact that Frank Miller flat out was saying, I'm making a fascist superhero. Here you go. And people were like, that's a great idea. What? Fascist? I don't know what you mean. Like, dude, it's not even subtext. But and I love the story. I'm looking at the trade paperback right now, but I'm like, Batman, like Scott Snyder his recent run on Batman. It's great, but he takes something that's dark and he has like a Bat family, Like, away from that. You can't. So there are some people who also kind of this is a very circular, who look at that nostalgia or look at things that are perceived as kiddie, and then they try too hard to justify it. Like, me personally, I'm not a Zack Snyder stan at all by any stretch of the imagination, just because dude's way too serious for me. And if you haven't noticed, I'm a bit sarcastic. But at the same time, I would never dismiss, like, even if Superman is like kind of a cornball, it's entertaining cornball. Captain America's cornball as shit. No one calls him kitty.
Yeah. Well, they lean so hard into that in the movies too. Like, it really makes really gives you the feeling of that character.
Yeah.
They sort of lean into that, like, archetype of 50s sort of, things have to be this way and this is right and this is wrong and there's no gray. It's all black and white. And yeah.
And having that, and that is natural, and in terms of storytelling, that's natural conflict because he's in a world that isn't like that. So that's what makes him compelling. Making Superman grim and gritty and depressed, it's like, all right, emo, we did Spider-Man 3. Build from that.
Yeah. Right. But before we get off of comics and cartoons and all that stuff, did you watch the original Avatar: Last Airbender?
No, I only just
heard God.
I only just heard about that, in all fairness. Like, I heard about it briefly when M. Night Shyamalan apparently ruined it.
Oh, fucked it all up.
But my knowledge of it, and this is going to sound ridiculous, is watching the Honest trailer on it. Because Honest Trailers did one on the Avatar: The Last Airbender. Because I think Avatar, and I think of James Cameron being an asshole. Making a movie that made $1 billion and no one remembers now. So I know my sister-in-law was into that kind of stuff. She's like, and I don't know if that's considered manga. I know it's on Nickelodeon. I don't know if it's considered part of manga. I don't know.
Well, so it would be more anime, right? So manga would be
Anime.
the comics. I think so, kind of. You know, I think it falls loosely under that umbrella, I would say.
That came out what, late 90s, early aughts?
It had to be early to mid aughts because my kid was born at that time.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know, maybe 2003, 2004, maybe.
That was when I was ending college. So, and I was watching almost nothing at that point.
Yeah,
That's not true. That's not true. I had my apartment, which didn't have cable, so I had like a handful of DVDs because DVDs used to be a thing, and I had a copy of Super Troopers.
Oh, great movie.
Don't tell my wife that, because I only had so many. Like she would come up like she didn't go to my college. We've known each other since high school, but so she would periodically come up and spend the weekend at my apartment, and there'd be, there's no TV. I'm out in the middle. My college was out in cow country and shit like that. We're not big partiers. We by the time we were 21, 22, we were like, we did the party scene. We're good. So we'd watch that on a loop to the point that when the sequel came out, she refused to sit down and watch it. She's like, no. And I'll sometimes drop. I'm one of those people who drops lines constantly. It's
yeah,
something
we
I've
do
done since I was
too.
a kid.
Yep.
And my wife will just look at me like, why? Just why? What? It's almost like Vietnam for her. She goes back and she just hears echoing in the back of her mind, the snozzberries taste like snozzberries. So I missed out on a lot. Like in all fairness, from the time I went to college in 2002 until literally my daughter was like turning 1, most media I kind of missed unless it was like B-level horror movies. Like the one thing I can say I discovered that most people don't know about is like Behind the Mask: The Rise of Leslie Vernon. And I'll tell people that and they're like, what's that? I'm like, it's the greatest slasher of all time, you fools. But most other things, unless it was music or things like that, I kind of missed out on a lot of stuff because I was too busy finishing up college and getting my teaching career going.
Right. Well, it's on Netflix, and I will say it was one of the best shows to ever be on TV.
Really?
It was amazing. Like it was aimed at the kids, but like it had a message, and it was well written, and it was funny, and you had your poignant moments in it. It was fantastic. I mean, it was amazing.
Cool. Like I said, my experience with it, beyond hearing that M. Night Shyamalan ruined the live action movie, was, like I said, the honest trailer. It came out actually not too long ago. I think it's like a week or two ago, and I was like, hey, I've heard of that. I think I don't get the jokes they're making because it's the honest trailer references the actual plot of the show, but I'm like, yay.
Yeah, if you have time, it's definitely worth a watch, and your kid would probably enjoy it too. I mean, it was, yeah.
It's funny, and you know this going into adulthood because things kind of, you hit blind spots, more and more blind spots as you get older, and the world becomes more interconnected. And I always feel vaguely like Steve Buscemi. I feel like the meme of Steve Buscemi going, "What's up, fellow kids?"
Yeah.
So, and certain things I just lean into it because fuck, I don't care. And other times I'll be almost the polar opposite. I'll be like in the classroom, I'll be like, all right, kids, who's heard of Jawbreaker? No one? Great. We're going to listen to 24-hour revenge therapy. You can't understand the notes? It doesn't matter, and that's the point.
Right. That's cool. All right. Well, so maybe we should talk a little bit about your writing. So, I mean, since you're here and, we're going to, try to push a book here. When did you first start to write? When did you first get that itch?
I'm gonna sound like one of those biographies that writers use that self-publish, and do their own covers. But I've always had an interest in writing. It really didn't take off as something of a focus, like beyond something, hey, I'm good at this. Because when I was a kid, I was drawing comic books with my friend Aaron. As something serious until I was 15 in high school. and I was in this creative writing class because at that point I was into horror fiction and stuff like that, and I had heard rumblings that there'd be like we'd be reading Stephen King stories, but it was also a writing class, and so we had to write stories, and I wrote terrible stories. The only one that was memorable was a guy who kills another guy and tries to eat his brains because he wants to get smarter. It was very visceral, and but we wrote a lot of stories, and about halfway through the course, the teacher gave kind of an assessment letter. Here's what you're strong at. Here's what I want you to work on. And in the recommendation, in both sides, he was like, "You're an amazing writer" and stuff like that. And I know you can make something of this, but in your back pocket, have a day job just until you make it. No, he's like, it's really hard to become famous doing this. It's really difficult. So find something else also that'll keep you fed while you're trying to pursue this. And I was like, okay. And that's where me wanting to be a writer, but then me also wanting to be a teacher kind of came from. But there are two ways of seeing a writing career, because a lot of writers come up from journalism, but they don't count journalism as their writing career. They count when they start publishing fiction. So I've been publishing since I was like 19 years old.
Oh, wow.
I befriended the music editor of the local college paper, and he had an opening, so I wrote a quick review, and he's like, "This is great." And then after I think 4 of those, they were like, "Hey, we're splitting this section up, and I need content. What do you have?" And I was like, "How about a column where I just ramble for 1,000 words a week?" He was like, "Do it." And that's where and they paid me to do that. I did it for 3 years. On top of like doing reviews and some reporting, kind of fell into journalism. My publishing career began in 2008 with like a zombie story, and like they pay you like $5 and shit like that. But it didn't really take off until about 10 years ago, and that's when it was like, oh, okay, now I'm doing this. This is what I do, and stuck with short stories, and that led up to my first book. Back in 2016. When did my first book come out? Shit. 2016. Yeah. When you have a kid, your years blur.
Right.
But yeah, so I've been writing since I was 19 years old. I've been a fiction writer or a writer of some note, or I've been a fiction writer for about 10 years, but I've been someone that actually kind of like, hey, I know that name vaguely for the past like 5 years or so.
Nice. Do you remember your first rejection letter?
Oh shit, yeah. Actually, it's funny you say that. Okay, so I used to submit back when it was uncommon to submit online. You would send out your manuscript, you send yourself a stamped envelope, and I was, Stephen King's On Writing came out in 2000, so I was 17 when that came out, and even then, it was still very much like you send out your story, and if they like it, they'll send you a contract, stuff like that. I have a really good Joe Hill anecdote on this too. But so I was sent, and so I'd go to like Barnes and Nobles and Borders, because Borders still existed then, trying to find what magazines were around. So there's Fantasy and Science Fiction. There was Cemetery Dance whenever it came out. There was Weird Tales, because Weird Tales was still going on for a while there. And then there was a magazine called Flesh and Blood. Weird Tales, the first rejection I really remember was from them, and they sent me like a 1.5-page long rejection note. Like, here's what was wrong with the story of why it didn't work. And it wasn't mean. It was like I remember reading it going, the fuck? And I was like, this is amazing. Because up until that point, I've been sending stories to like Flesh and Blood and Fantasy and Science Fiction, and getting like little like notepad rejection notes, and it was almost a checklist, like, this is not for us or whatever. And here's this 1.5-page long rejection note of like, I had said something stupid in I forget what even story it was about, but I referenced a book, and I had a stupid line in there, like, it wasn't as big as the Oxford Dictionary. And I was actually thinking of Webster's, but they wrote in the letter, you have to realize the Oxford Dictionary is 2 volumes long. And I was like, oh, I did not know that, because I was a kid. So I remember that. Fast forward a few years. I'm on Facebook. My writing career's kind of started taking off before my first book came out. And I befriended the editor of Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood lasted a few years. And I was saying to him, like, I used to submit to your magazine all the time, never got in, but I would read it. And he was like, I have a bunch of them laying around. Do you want them? I was like, fuck yeah. So like a week, nice. I gave him my address and then thought nothing of it. And like 3 weeks later, this huge, like thick manila envelope of most of the issues, he just gave them to me. And I have them on the shelf. But I have them on in a magazine rack beneath, on top of my ego shelf where I put all my own shit. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. It's a pain in the ass, but I kind of miss physically submitting something because you had that evidence, like, hey, they at least saw the fucking thing.
Right. Somebody grabs it.
And I say that as someone who has edited a magazine, I've edited a few books, and that would be a pain in the fucking ass to do. So I know, and I appreciate technology at that point, but there's a part of me that's like, that was nice then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You go to the back of the mag, look, see what the submittal guidelines were, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, and that's my rejection stories. I was talking with Joe Hill a few years back. This is that interview I did, and we were talking, and he had a PO box, and before he started, and he'll say this in interviews, before he was kind of resigned, it's like, why not write horror stories? I'm Joe Hill. I'm not Joseph King. I'm not Stephen King's son. I'm Joe Hill. He would try to send stuff to like Esquire and GQ and The Atlantic and shit like that. And so he'd go to his PO box, and there'd be the, his self-addressed stamped envelopes in there with the rejection pieces and stuff like that. And there was one time he went, and I think it was The Atlantic. It wasn't his self-addressed stamped envelope. It was a new envelope from The Atlantic, I think it was, with their masthead on the return address. And he got really excited. And this is back before cell phones. So he went to a payphone and calls his wife. And he's like, oh my God, I got this thing from The Atlantic. And they were getting, he and her hyping each other up, and they're psyching each other up, and they're like, open it. Should I wait till we get home? No, open it now. And he opens it up on the phone with his wife and pulls out a standard rejection note. And on the bottom, someone had written, we're sorry we lost your self-addressed stamped envelope. And your And I was like, that is, and I said this to him, like, that is the best rejection story ever. Like, I'm happy with my Weird Tales rejection. I'm happy with making friends with the former editor of Flesh and Blood. But that blows every rejection story I've ever heard out of the water.
Yeah. Oh,
he's like, I can laugh about it now, but I couldn't. I was crushed. I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't walk into traffic. But
yeah, man, that's brutal.
Oh.
Do you have a process? Do you have like a certain, make a cup of tea, find a quiet spot in the house, you write at a certain time of the day? Do you have any sort of rituals or anything that you go through?
There's that whole chestnut that writers are superstitious, and I am fairly superstitious. But it's become trendy now to like write in fucking Starbucks and shit. I used to be a lot more ritualistic. And to be fair, I didn't write anything good when I was like that. I used to have an office, and it was like decorated with my shit that I liked and all that kind of stuff. And I used to chain smoke while I'd be writing, but mostly I'd be playing on fucking Facebook, so it wasn't writing. It was when I got rid of the office and I started writing in the kitchen. I literally write at my kitchen table. That I started doing something. And even then I used to have like minor rituals of like, I'll go have a cigarette, and then I'll read a certain amount of what I did yesterday and do a little editing. Then I'll go have another cigarette. Then I'll start writing, and then I'll listen to this album and blah, 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 blah. Anymore, it's more like, hey, do I have 2 hours and it's fairly quiet? All right, let's go. Or even an hour and a half. It's enough to get to like 1,500, 2,000 words a day. Right. And anymore, it's like, do I have a cup of coffee? Do I have my toothpick just so I can chew on something while I'm reading whatever I wrote the day before? And then I just go from there. Sometimes I'll listen to music, sometimes I won't. It really, and I typically write at night because that's when my kid goes to bed. My wife has to get up early, so by 10 o'clock my house is fucking dead. So I'm like, all right, and I'm unfortunately a bit of a night owl, which is not really good when you're a teacher. So I'd have like an hour and a half to like just sit down and write. But like during the summer, I'll write during the day and then feel vaguely aimless the rest of the day. It's like, wait, what am I supposed to do now? Right. I spent 10 months writing at night, and then all of a sudden I can write during the day, and it's like, what the hell am I supposed to do with my time?
Yeah. Write more.
No, it's funny. I know some writers who can just keep going and going and going, but I've also talked to a lot of writers, and there's a tap out point where there's just a point where you're not putting anything good down on paper. Like, and it might look good to you at the time, but the next day when you're reading over that shit, it's coming out. It's gone.
Right.
So I tend to be. There have been times where I can really. When I used to smoke, I used to be able to write a lot more. I think it's because it raises your blood rate, in your head, and maybe. I mean, there have been times where I've been able to write a whole story in a day, but usually I'm a 1,500, 2,000 word. Maybe if I'm feeling really inspired, 3,000 words a day, and then I'm kind of done. Then you hear people like Brian Keene or Jonathan Mayberry, and they're like, "Yeah, I wrote 6,000 words." I'm like, "The fuck?"
Right.
First, fuck you.
Yeah.
The first time I met John Mayberry, I was kind of roped in to help organize this regional convention in Pittsburgh. I was still living in Pittsburgh at the time. And they wanted me to kind of get some horror writers because they'd always built themselves as a science fiction, fantasy, and horror convention. They didn't know any fucking horror people. They knew me. That was it. Because all their friends were sci-fi fantasy geeks. And I don't say geeks in a derogatory manner. It's just what they were. I'm a horror geek. So they're like, "Hey, can you ask a few people?" I was like, "Sure." John Mayberry was living in PA at the time, and I invited him out to come to this convention called Confluence. And 1, he's huge, and 2, he wears really loud Hawaiian shirts, but 3, he's in the Martial Arts Hall of Fame, so he moves like fucking a slight breeze. Like, he startles the shit out of me every time he's around. But in the middle of the convention, whenever he didn't have a reading or a panel or a signing to do, he was at the Starbucks trying to finish, at the time he was writing Joe Ledger books. And he'd just be banging them out. I'm like, "How many did you do?" I did 8,000 words. I was like, "What the fuck?"
Wow.
Yeah, I maybe I'd be able to do that if this was my full time. I did it for a living kind of thing. Maybe. But I get too distracted by literally life itself.
Yeah.
Like, I'm 1,500 words in, but the dog needs to go for a walk,
Right.
I'm 1,000 words in, but I haven't eaten in 18 hours,
Yeah. Well, that's, they say that, rituals and things aside, like the only way to write is to just sit at the table and write. Like you said, if you've got an hour and a half, fuck, I'm gonna take an hour and a half and I'm gonna write as much as I can, or I'm gonna, work on this scene that I'm trying to develop or whatever. As opposed to like, well, that's not really I'll have tomorrow. If I wait till tomorrow, I can plan to get out a little bit earlier, and then I'll have some more time, and then I can get some good writing in.
If you're writing, you're a writer. I know people who look at my 2,000 words and they're like, "That's a lot," because they'll work on a paragraph for a week. Yes, not that they're fucking around. It's just like they don't have a lot of time, or the words don't come as quickly for them, so they really want to work on phrasing and stuff like that. And they'll try various things throughout the week, and then they'll write a paragraph, they'll delete it, then they'll break into 2 paragraphs, and they'll delete one of them, and it's like, and they turn out fair, good works. I'm not gonna drop names because I'm not sure if they're like comfortable talking process. And I'm like, hey, as long as you're writing, who gives a fuck? Because it is, the world we were talking about before, pop culture, certain things like people want to kind of like, that's a kid thing, that's a kiddie thing. And there is something vaguely self-conscious about creating art, because you're not creating power lines, you're not digging ditches, you're not building houses, you're creating fantasy worlds. And even in the most confident people, I bet if you asked Stephen King in an honest moment, he would be like, there'd be probably still times that he kind of goes, I make believe for a living, I play pretend. And you have to kind of gird yourself against that and be like, no, I'm making art. And I kind of go back to an earlier point I said, if you're just entertaining someone, that's still valid. But people, when you talk about art, it's easy to get defensive.
Yeah, yeah. I tend to fall into the I don't know if I have enough time. I mean, I write mostly for my blog. I've written a couple of short things.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing that's come out yet. But I kind of like, well, I've got an hour. It's not worth it. Like I still fall into that trap, and I know that it's just a matter of sitting down and clacking away at the keyboard. But like I haven't gotten over that hump yet.
And it works differently for other people, every person. I remember when my daughter was an infant, and I used to teach in Pennsylvania. I teach in Virginia now, and they cut budgets, so they cut staffing. So I was laid off. My wife was still working, and so I'd go pick her up at like 9 o'clock at night, and I'd put my daughter would be like sleeping in the would start, or she would come home around 9 o'clock at night. I put my daughter to bed like 8:30, 8:15. So I'd have literally a half hour, 45 minutes to get something on the page. And I remember the agony of waiting for my computer. I used to have a desktop at that point to load up so I could be like, let me write something, God damn it. And I'd get like a paragraph in, but it would feel good to get that paragraph down. Yeah. And I think because of that necessity, I kind of lost that. I only have an hour. The only time I do that now is if it's like 11 o'clock and I'm like, I have a half hour, but I'm also falling asleep as I stand here in the kitchen doorway. So yeah, I'm not doing it tonight.
Yeah. Fair.
I mean, I once came home, they called me in for jury duty a few years back, and they didn't select me because I teach in a small town. And so when you're a teacher in a small town, even if you don't know directly everyone, you know someone that person also knows. Mm-hmm. So if someone's accused of a crime, chances are you know someone related to him because you teach that kid, their kid. And right. So I was, of course, booted out of the jury pool, which was fine with me because I really didn't want to take off work. I'll go and I'll do my duty. But if you're going to be like, no, you're not what I want, I'm like, excellent. So I had to report at like 8 o'clock. I was out by 11:30. My daughter was in school. My wife was at work. I had the day to myself. I'm like, all right. And I literally came home and I had until, when did she get out of school at that point? It was like 3:30. So I had until 3:30 and I just wrote. And I wrote a story. It came out a few years back. It was in Dark Moon Digest. It was about an alien invasion kind of thing. And sex aliens. It was weird. It was a weird little story. But it was fun. And I wrote like 3,000 words in like a day, and I was really pleased with myself. But I'm also the guy again who would be like, I have a half hour before my wife gets home and I want to hang out with her, so I'm gonna put a paragraph down on this thing,
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. Now when you do write, do you outline stuff out, or do you just kind of pants it, go through it, and sort of let things develop as you're going along? How do you approach that?
A lot of my stories, actually 99.9% of my stories are what ifs. Like, what if that happened? Or I'll picture a scene in my head and I won't know the context, and I'll try to figure out the context. And I'll just work through it. That leads me to writing myself into corners a lot, but it also keeps it fresh. The only time I've ever outlined anything was when I co-wrote the novella How We Broke with Bracken MacLeod. And he and I had never collaborated with each other before, or really with anyone. He had collaborated on a short story with John Bowden once, but it was like a flash piece, I think. It was like 1,500 words. We were writing a novella. So we had to plot it out. And the way we did it, I don't know if it's a traditional outline, is the story, a big element of the story is a Polaroid camera and these old photographs, these old Polaroids. So what we did was we outlined it as like, okay, well, we'll say there are 12, I think, how many Polaroids? There was a handful of Polaroids, or a certain number. And we're like, okay, so what is this one? What could the scene be about that? And then we would take turns. That's the only time I've ever outlined. A lot of times, a lot of it is I'll get an idea or I'll get a scene in my head and I'll be like, all right, where are these people coming from and where are they going? I haven't done it in 8 years. I used to run a writing workshop at a convention, the Confluence I mentioned. And one of the things when I teach is I like a lot of hands-on material. And English is one of those things that you wouldn't think are hands-on, but fuck it, you can write. That's hands-on. So after spending time doing exercises on like opening lines and natural dialogue and escalation of conflict and blah blah blah, to kind of sum up what I was teaching, I'd be like, I'll give them a prompt. I'll be like, there's a room where there are two people, and at the end of the scene, only one will leave. What does all that mean? Figure it out. Go. And they would sit there and write, and I did it that time as well. And I came up with this opening line of, Bobby found it easier to hold a gun to a little girl's head than he would have thought, or something along those lines. And I was like, what the fuck's that? And let's figure it out. And it ended up being a story called Baby Grows a Conscience. It was in my, and it was published. It was at the time, it was the quickest I'd written a story and sold a story, because the convention was in July. At the end of July, I wrote the story on the beginning of August, sent it at the end of August. It got accepted by a magazine by the end of September. No, middle of September, because it was around my birthday. And it was and that was in 2010. And that was the quickest that had ever happened to me. And I thought that was amazing. But I love stories like that where I'm like, I don't even know what the fuck's going on. So it could blow up in my face. I have a folder on my computer or on one of my flash drives that's just full of ideas that start off really good, then I just kind of run out of gas because either I've written myself into a corner, I don't know where to go with it, or there just wasn't enough there to really go somewhere with it. It was just kind of a cool notion that I was just kind of practicing. It's like playing scales on a musical instrument, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's just how I do it.
That's cool. Half joking, do you enjoy like just the process of sitting and writing?
I know there's that chestnut. It's like I hate writing, but I love have written, and I'm like,
right.
No, I enjoy writing. Like, okay, so the pandemic came down, and if nothing else, so I start teaching virtually because you have to. And so I have suddenly a lot more time on my hands because, with the way my county is where we teach, like we couldn't teach one-to-one. We couldn't like, okay, you have class at 8 o'clock. No, now it's class on a computer at 8 o'clock because not everyone had access. So you'd end up putting up a lot of stuff online and record little short videos. So, but most of your day is actually, I had to myself or hanging out with the kid. So I had a lot of time writing. And if nothing, I was like, oh, I can write so much now. And I wrote a lot. But there also is a point where there is a lot of that. I'm basically practicing the skill of writing. So there are a lot of stories I kind of went, I don't think so. I think I wrote between March and June, like 10 stories, but like 4 of them are good. Some as soon as I finished them, I printed them out and I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to edit this. And I just put it in a folder and be like, it's a nice idea. Maybe I'll cannibalize it. But even when the story isn't going well, I enjoy it. I enjoy thinking about how the story, like, it sounds like I find my own stories dull, but I use it to fall asleep. I'll be thinking like, okay, I want to write the story. I have to write the scene. So it calms my head. It helps me calm my thinking because it gives me something to focus on as I kind of relax. I don't know if you can hear that. Those are my dogs. So no, I do enjoy the process of writing.
Cool. What's the longest you've ever been stalled on a story, in the process of writing?
I usually am stalled until I get a better idea or it works itself out. So if I'm working on something and it kind of stalls out on me, I'll still be putting words on a page. It might not be good words, but I'll put words on a page. And then it'll either work itself out because I'll think of whatever tripped me up, or I'll get a better idea and be like, all right, am I writing this for any reason other than I kind of had a cool idea? No? Then fuck it and move on. And that's kind of what I do. So there is no real like, oh, I was stuck on a story for 3 months. No, by that point, I've written like 3 other stories.
Right. That's fair. So sometimes I feel like that could be like it's like something stuck in your tooth. You keep worrying at it because like, you have that grain there that you want to build around, and like, you write a certain way and you're like, I don't know if that's going to go anywhere. And then, but, kind of like percolates for a while.
Yeah, I will let things percolate for a long time. The new book, it percolated in my head for about 3 or 4 years before I sat down and wrote it last year. Just because I was working on other things, and plus I didn't know what I wanted to do with it.
Right. You said you're a teacher. How hard is it to find a balance between everything that goes on day to day and then, carving out that time? I know you said you tend to write, at the end of the evening when everybody goes to bed, so maybe that just makes it easy that way.
It does. I mean, at this point, I've been a teacher for 14 years. So I kind of, even when I teach, like I've been teaching ninth grade now for 4 or 5 years straight, and just ninth grade. So you kind of get run into it. It's like, okay, I know the material backwards and forwards, so I can come up with creative ways, and it's not going to take up extraordinary amount of time in order to do it. But no, it's more like I get home, I kind of work. My working schedule is kind of like I try to make everything in such a way that very rarely do I have to bring stuff home, just because I have a very project-based class. It's the way I teach. So there aren't a lot of worksheets or test or grades, more project-based. So periodically I have to bring stuff home because they're projects. But when I'm home, I'm being a dad or I'm being a husband. So like my day kind of breaks up like, okay, from 6:30 until 7:30, I'm dad because I'm getting my kid ready for school. From 8 o'clock till 3 o'clock, I'm Mr. Anderson. From 3:05 until 8:45 or 8 o'clock, I'm dad and or Paul because I'm a husband. And then once everyone goes to bed, it's like, okay, now I'm Paul Michael Anderson. So it's like switching identities almost. Dude, the only reason why I use my middle name is because my name is so fucking common. When I first started writing, I wasn't using my middle name. I was just Paul Anderson. And there's a clear line of demarcation on my ego shelf, my ego bookcase actually at this point, between where I was Paul Anderson versus Paul Michael Anderson. One, the story's almost changed. They're much more weird, because they would add the book onto Amazon or Goodreads or whatever, and it was so hard to get them like, this is my story. Yes, but which Paul Anderson are you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you the Paul 16 spaces Anderson because that's how they would have to code it, or are you Paul 15 spaces Anderson because that's how you'd have to code it? So, at that point I was friends with the writer Damian Angelica Walters, and I was like, what the fuck do I do? Do I do PM Anderson, which I don't like, or do I do Paul Michael Anderson? She's like, do Paul Michael Anderson. I'm like, well, 3 names, that works with Damian Angelica Walters. Like, well, I have a bias, obviously. But it works out. So now when I'm a teacher, I'm signing stuff as a teacher, I'm just Paul Anderson. I'm like, I should put my middle name.
Right.
It looks weird without it.
Right. So have you ever had a parent come up and go, oh my God, I read your last book, it blew me away?
I try. Okay. Yes and no. I generally try to separate both lifestyles. Like my writing does inform how I teach because I actually use it. People wonder like, how am I going to use this in real life? I'm like, motherfucker, I do use this in real life. So shut up. But I tend to be like, I don't tend to be like, well, when I wrote this book, students, and this is how I don't do that. But kids, they're tech natives, so they're like, hey, I think I found you on Amazon. I'm like, don't read that book. It's very violent. There are dead children in it. I was picking my daughter up from school, and I was in the car rider lane. So I'm in a line with a bunch of other parents in our cars, and I'm reading a book, and they had the kids line up, and and the aide helps the kid get in the car and stuff like that. And she leans down. She's like, is your middle name Michael? And I was like, why? Because my daughter had you and she said you were a writer, so we looked you up. If I brought and she wanted your book, so I got it for her. If I brought the book, would you sign it? I'm like, yeah, I think.
But don't let her read it.
Yeah.
I'll sign it, but just hold on to it.
Literally, it was Bones Are Made to Be Broken, and the title novella is about a mom in the early 90s raising a kid, and she suffers a nervous breakdown. So it's about mental illness. The last story of the collection is called, it was a reprint from an anthology, and it's called All You That You Leave Behind, and it was about this couple that miscarries, but they become aware of a version of reality where they had the baby. They went through the pregnancy, and as the story progresses, the two realities kind of start merging, and what that would do to someone who just lost a child. So there's a lot of traumatic stuff in there. I'm like, please don't. She never did. Like, it was never mentioned again. But then I had a student. She had graduated. She's in law school now, actually. She came back to visit her parents like that, and she wanted to stop by the school. And she was like, "Hey, can I visit you, Anderson?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So she comes in. It was like the day before holiday break, and she pulls out my first book, and she's like, "Would you sign it?" And I was like, "You're fucking kidding me." So I literally went to the title page. And writers always, when they autograph, sometimes put a little message, and I just put really big on there, "Don't read this," and then signed it, and then gave it back. But in general, I try to keep them separate because it always feels vaguely like I'm bragging, like, "Hi, I am your English teacher who writes for a living." And I feel like I should have, leather patches on my blazers and a really hemorrhoidal asshole,
Well, like you said, kids are so tech savvy that it just seems like, it's the kind of thing that would, tend to come up, I guess.
It does. At a certain point every year, it does tend to come up, and I'll make a joke about it. But I rest assured in the fact it's the only time I'm ever grateful for the pandemic illiteracy in this country is most kids aren't going to be bothered.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
I'm like, yes, don't be a reader. Reading is for losers. Now do your grammar homework. But no, I do try to keep them separated, but it always does come up at some point, and I always kind of play it down.
All right. And what kind of stuff do you read yourself? Do you read mostly horror, or are you kind of mix around?
I mean, I'm looking at one of my bookcases right now. I kind of have a mix of everything. Like, obviously, horror is going to have a huge portion of my book space. But, like, if you ask me my top 5 favorite books, I'd have something like Another Day of Paradise by Eddie Little, which was a crime novel written while he was in prison. I'd have a book like The Partly Cloudy Patriot, which is a series of essays by Sarah Vowell. I'd have Theodore Rex, the middle biography of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency by Edmund Morris. I read everything. I tend to be drawn to dark stuff. Right now I'm reading The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones because the dude's fucking amazing. I tend to like a lot of everything. Like I might not be geared towards one thing or another. Like, for example, I'm not a big sci-fi fan, but I love Nnedi Okorafor's Binti trilogy. That blew me the fuck away. I love Neuromancer by William Gibson. I don't read William Gibson anymore because I'm not interested in anything else he's written, but Neuromancer was amazing when I read it. I'm looking around. I'm looking at my shelf right now. I'm like, I'm a big fan of the Richard Stark novels. Richard Stark was Don Westlake's pen name. He wrote where he would write these really hard-boiled novels about Parker, a burglar, and they're amazing. I structured my latest book over how Parker novels were because there was Parker novels are always broken up into 4 parts, and it's either the second or third one because it's been a few years since I read a Parker novel where it would be out of his POV and it would be into like his antagonist POV or a supporting character's POV, and that section of the book would be from that character's point of view, and then you'd come back to Parker. So when I wrote Standalone, like the second section of the book is told from the perspective of my main character's coworkers, and then I jump back to my main character. Like, what else do I have on my shelves right now? I have some Jill Lansdale. I even have the only book that Hugh Laurie, the actor who played House, he wrote a novel once called The Gun Seller, and it was kind of a spoof spy novel. Thing's fucking hilarious. But no, I have all 3 of George Carlin's books. I read everything. Yeah, horror tends to take precedent, but I love. You have to read everything, man, just so you can see what's out there, see what they're doing.
Yeah, I tend to jump back and forth between fiction and nonfiction, and then fiction would be like sci-fi, fantasy, horror.
Yeah.
I read a lot of like history,
Yeah.
military history, stuff like that. Um,
God, you are a dad.
yeah, well, because like I love Charles DeLint,
Okay.
absolute favorite author. But like I can only read so much fiction at once because then I don't want to say it blends together, right? Because everything's got its own unique story and characters and whatever.
Yeah.
But like I need to like mix that up and like read a history of like Genghis Khan or some shit, like
Yeah.
just kind of blow that out of the water and reset.
Oh, and that makes perfect sense. And that's a natural thing. I don't understand people who can only read one thing, one type of thing. It's like, man, like I love coffee ice cream, but if that's all I ever could eat for the rest of my life, I'd get really bored of coffee ice cream.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Uh, you were talking about Damien Angelica Walters. Have you been out to Necronomicon?
I have not. I've never been up to Necronomicon. I know one of the organizers, and they've been threatening to invite me. I'm not much of a weird writer, so I don't know if I'd fit in there. Um, but it always sounds really interesting.
It's a great con. I mean, it's about 2,000 people, and it's all over. I mean, obviously it's mainly weird fiction, cosmic horror, but there's straight horror
Yeah.
writers there as
Oh yeah.
well, and it's such a good time.
I mean, it always seemed like a good time. Before the pandemic hit, this was going to be my big con year. I was
Yeah.
hitting Scares That Care because I'm a big supporter of that charity con. I was going to hit Nikon because I've been threatening to do that forever, and people were like, "You need to come." And I was going to hit Confluence plus whatever else came up. Confluence was a regional con in Pennsylvania because that's when originally the book was going to come out, but then the pandemic hit, everything got canceled, so we had to kind of scramble. Um, but Necronomicon has always been one of those like, oh, that only happens every other year. That sounds really interesting, and I know a bunch of people who go. So
Mhm.
it's definitely a goal at some point.
Well, 2021's the year, assuming we're able to do it.
Yeah, assuming we get the hell out of this.
Yeah, man, I fingers crossed because like that's my big, every other year, like that's my big trip.
Yeah.
Like go and spend 5 or 6 days and tool around province, and yeah, it's yeah, we take over the
That's
weird
what I hear.
community.
That's what I hear.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, and the people from all over. People come from Canada. People come from the UK. A lot of the game writers and stuff like that are over there, like Mike Mason and those guys.
Yeah.
Um, it's so much fun.
It's like I said, and that's the one thing with social media. You kind of get a vicarious voyeuristic experience through it, and it seems like it's a blast.
Yeah. Well, speaking of social media, how do you handle the the conundrum of social media with its positives and clearly negative aspects?
You know, it is a conundrum but the conundrum's effect is as much as you invest in it. I was talking with someone about this recently, like in the past, like 48 hours. I was like, I always kind of view Twitter as very high speed, high interest, but the dumpster fire, it blazes hot and bright.
Yeah.
Whereas Facebook is more of a slower dumpster fire. It's one you can warm your hands by, and kind of take in the sense. But it's all in how you cultivate your social media. Like my Twitter is kind of open. Like I don't have it locked down, so you can't see it unless you follow me or I allow you to follow me. But I'm very wary of who I follow. I'm very wary of what I look at, just because I can't invest all my time in that, man. I know like
Mhm.
there are tons of things that go on, and some of it is creaky stairs that are finally getting repaired, for lack of a better term, or at least getting awareness on. And those are good, but they almost never directly involve me, and a lot of people tend to flock on them like vultures. And it's like, you're not signal boosting, you're not adding anything to it, you just want someone to pay attention to you, and that's not helping anyone. And so I always try to avoid it. Social media, if nothing else, has really taught me it's like I don't have to share my opinion on fucking everything
Right.
because it's not always needed or warranted. I might have an opinion, but I can talk about it with my wife or my friends. I don't need to jump in on every. I don't need to jump into every dumpster fire, you know. And I think, and I've been seeing a lot of people kind of come to the same conclusion recently. And I guess that's a good thing because we've all been stuck on social media, so people are kind of like really starting to get the idea of maybe cultivating their own spaces a little more judiciously, because the world's going to boogie along no matter how many retweets you get. You know, you could be a reply guy to Donald Trump's Twitter feed. No one gives a fuck.
Yeah.
What are you changing? Ooh, you had a sick burn, and I'm as guilty. I'm not throwing stones. I'm as guilty of that as anyone. If I think of a sick burn, I'm gonna fucking reply.
Right. Yeah, I've done it
because it's funny, damn it. But I don't ever think, oh, I'm gonna get so many. Who gives a fuck? At the end of the day, you're gonna log off and have to go take a dump anyway, you know. And that's about as gonna change the world as much as your fucking hashtag, you know.
Yeah. It's insidious though, right? Because like you said, you're on. It's always there. People are always saying stuff, and you're like you say, you're like, oh, fuck, I should say blah blah blah. But
yeah,
at the end of the day, it's not worth the aggravation. I have a friend. I see him. I'll get notifications that he's replied to something somewhere or whatever, and I'm like, dude, you're beating your head against the wall. Like, there's no point. You're not changing anybody's opinion.
I mean, I think social media also has its uses after the death of like George Floyd, and there was a lot of protesting. So there were a lot of links to like the Minnesota Bail Fund, things like that. Like I gave, if you can't make it out to a protest in Minnesota because you're stuck in Virginia or Arizona, you can give money to help get the people out of jail when they're arrested for protesting. Right. So there's some good to it, but you're not gonna convince the Twitter handle MAGA Mama to suddenly turn against her cult leader. It's not gonna happen, and all you're gonna do is frustrate yourself and wonder and think of all the sick burns you should have said to her when you can't sleep that night.
Right.
And sometimes, and that can kind of, well, I want to be an ally. I want to be an ally. It's like, you just retweeting something doesn't make you an ally. What are you doing? You know, so it's all in how you cultivate it, and that's something I've been like kind of watching myself do. Like on Facebook, I kind of keep like I have, it's locked down unless you're friends with me, you can't see anything, and I try to comb through my friends list pretty judiciously, but I kind of keep that more of like, hey, I don't even share pictures of my kid,
right.
Because I say that for my wife, and my wife has like 7 friends deliberately. I have more. I have more of a profile. I'm an author. So I have 1,700 or 7. But it's a more of a like, okay, I could say something here, or I could actually go do something about it, or I could give my support by sharing the link to the Minnesota Bail Fund, and hopefully someone else will join in. And that's how I kind of view it. It's like, yeah, it's a conundrum, but it's only a conundrum as much as you make it to be one.
Yeah, well, like you said, I was gonna say, as you curate your feeds and your friends list and stuff like that. Block early, block often, and there is a space within there with really cool people that you can connect with and do stuff like this or play games together or meet out for a beer. You find out that they're in your local area, so there are definitely some good aspects to it, but man, you gotta get through a lot of chaff to get there sometimes.
And there's that, and there's also within oneself, you have to realize that not everything you think or say is this nugget that the world needs, and that's a hell of a thing for a writer to say, but the spotlight doesn't always have to be on me. The spotlight doesn't have to be on any particular one person unless it's like someone important having to. It's going on in the world. And that's the thing that I think, like I said, the conundrum is only as much of a problem as you make it. And a lot of people like they don't know how to mentally log off. Even if they're off the social media, they're still thinking about it. It's like, why?
Yeah.
What is that doing for you? Now, for people who are really introverted and that's how they connect, and that's a whole different thing, and I can't begin to speak on that. I wouldn't presume to speak on that. But if you have an outside life, an outer life of some kind, outer by which I define as anything beyond Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that, even someone you text with, I consider an outer life. Then focus on that. Tend that garden, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in a, you know, it sounds stupid, but in a real space, you know, like you said, even texting, that's someone in a physical space where, like, you know, online, it's just like it's almost like it's not a real thing. I mean, it's how you get trolls up there talking about, oh, we're gonna, you know, kill your kids and punch in your face and like all this stuff because it's not real, you know. So
I know, but and that is a danger because there are people who that blind blurs. There
True.
is that. I mean, for most people who are, you know, not twisted, the line's pretty strong. Like, I have my outer life with my friends, my family, even friends I've made through Facebook. Like, I met Bracken MacLeod through Facebook. I met Max Booth and Damien Angelica Walters through Facebook. I consider them friends. Most of them, with the exception of Max, I've actually met in meet space and hung out with.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who that line blurs, and it's both damaging for them mentally because they can't separate, or it's damaging because there are people to others because they are dangerous and they are going to try to find your fucking address. And that's the fear of it. And that's, like I said, the conundrum. Some people make it bigger than they are because maybe their outer life lacks. I don't know. It is I like that term, conundrum, because it is one.
Yeah.
And I'm probably speaking from a place of privilege where it's like, yeah, it doesn't really affect me, but I'm a straight white male, man. You know, I am the bumper bowling character of life. So I can't speak to someone of a marginalized community. I don't know what social media is like if you're marginalized, and I can't presume to speak like that. It probably is vastly different even online, you know, and that might be one of their few safe spaces where they can kind of cultivate some form of an outer life, where they can meet up, like you said, and meet cool people and like do gaming or whatever their interests are, happen to be.
Yeah, I would imagine, and again, not being able to speak to it, but that, you know, the sort of problems that, you know, those communities face, you know, in their daily lives at work and, you know, driving around and, you know, just doing whatever is the same online and maybe even worse online, you know, until you can cultivate that and sort of, you know, like I said, block early, block often.
Yeah, agreed. Social media. I mean, I tend to enjoy it because I go in there and I'll share, like, I'll see a funny meme or I'll hear about a cool book, and that's how I use it. But I have that luxury.
Yeah, they were lucky in that regard.
Yeah.
All right. So let me throw this at you, and then we'll get into some book stuff. How do you think that the world of traditional publishing has been affected by the self-publishing or the indie press that's such a big part of the space that we move in?
You know, I think like anything, big publishing, like most of the entertainment venue, it just chases wherever the shiny coin is. You know, the guy who wrote The Martian, the guy who Hugh Lowry, that's not the guy who wrote The Martian, but there's that other guy, Hugh Lowry. They came out from self-publishing. The guy who wrote Ready Player One, I think he self-published that. 50 Shades of Grey was originally self-published or vaguely self-published, you know, and Hollywood and the entertainment industry jumps onto it. All it did was it made the noise a little noisier. I don't think it changed. I think it showed a lot of people that, I think if for people who need that confidence boost of, hey, you can do this either through a micro press or a small press or self-publishing. Hey, you know, you might have a shot. You could do this. Go try it. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who honestly shouldn't. They don't have, like, you know, there are people like, you don't need talent to write. I'm like, yeah, you do. Anyone can write. Anyone can write. Talent means that what you write is interesting. Anyone can write a clear sentence. It is possible. Anyone can write clearly and effectively. Interestingly, though, that's different, and that's where the talent comes in. Talent is table salt cheap, cheaper than table salt, but it is prevalent. So a lot of self-published thing is competently written, but it's not interesting. But again, that's the interest itself is inherently subjective. So self-publishing, I don't think changed much. I think other than a possible intrinsic confidence boost to people who might need it. But in terms of how the business conducted itself, I'm not in Big Five, so I can't. I'm just watching the trends come along for the past few years. It's like it didn't really change much. Big Five still pumps out the self-help books and the ghost-written celebrity memoirs, and the big one seasonal novel from this author who hasn't given a fuck about a paycheck in 20 years, because they live on a boat. And then you have everyone else.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like I guess it's like a small ripple, right? Like, so they don't probably really notice, but again, like you said, they're churning out stuff that's geared for the culture. So in some regards, it's vapid, it's popcorn, it's something that's not going to you're not going to remember, the next Brad Ford novel or whatever the fuck.
Yeah.
Who cares? Like, you go kill the bad guys, it's over. You find it at your Goodwill store, somebody read it and, got rid of it right away. Where like in this, maybe not so much self-publishing, but in the indie press market, so like Hippocampus and, all these places, you're getting more quality writing, from people who wouldn't necessarily have the chance to, publish with Dalton or whatever. They're able to work in a space and churn out really good work, that's nominated, for all these awards that we see, within the community.
Yeah, I think if nothing else, self-publishing kind of showed how cheap it is to publish. So a lot of publishers, some who should be there, and some who really were just wanting to spend what Nick Mamatas calls like, hey, you got insurance money from an accident claim. You want to use it on publishing? Great. Good vanity project. But it did provide a bigger space. Like I said, it makes the noise noisier. So you have to still be just as a reader, as a consumer, you still have to be just as exacting of what you want. And sometimes there are a lot of Patricia Kellerman novels out there, or Jonathan Kellerman, I'm sorry. Patricia Cornwell is what I'm thinking of. But you might find someone good like Shane Stevens or Ling Ma, who wrote a great, really quiet post-apocalyptic novel called Severance. It was a really weird post-apocalyptic novel, but it was great. And it was published by a Big Five. But in terms of like how the business conducted itself, everyone's like, oh, it's self-publishing is going to change the world. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. I mean, I remember watching that, and I know Chuck Wendig kind of jumped in as like, hey, why can't we all just get along? It's all good. It's all gravy. And it's like, it's all the same as it ever has been.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I mean, and for people who can make a living at self-publishing, good for them. Good for them. If they can find, because like I was saying earlier, it's like anyone can write effectively. Interestingly, it's a different story, but interest itself is inherently subjective. What I find completely dog shit boring, someone else could be like, this is what I've been looking for the entire time I've been reading books. I just didn't know it. And things I find are like almost life affirming. People will be like, the fuck you like that for? So. But that's the way it's always been. There was no golden age of publishing. I mean, I remember I was reading a biography of Theodore Roosevelt because he was an actual writer before he was president. I mean, it was like travel and war shit, but he was a working writer, and there was a section in one of the biographies. I think it's in The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt by Edmund Morris. And they're talking about how he just had these agreements with the actual publisher who ran the publishing house, which is not that much different than me talking to Max Booth III of Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing. And it's like, you're not going to, it hasn't changed. And that was 100-some years ago. It's not, publishing itself by itself is someone creates a product, someone else says, I will distribute that product and take a cut, and then it goes out. And that's the end of the story. Whether you're self-publishing or you're by Big Five or you're small press, that is the beginning and end of the story. Creator, middleman, consumer. Whether the middleman is Amazon distributing it and helping you upload the file, or it is, McGraw-Hill putting out the book for you, someone else is doing it. And unless you're selling, hand-stapled manuscripts from the trunk of your car, there's always the business model does not change. We call it a different change, but it's still the same thing. It's just the access point is different.
Yeah, I guess that's the biggest thing, and I would imagine more responsive too, right? Like, you get Max, you could text Max or shoot him an email, and you're going to get a response right away. Where if you're dealing with, one of these big companies, it's not as personal.
Yeah, there is that personal thing, but that's what I was saying about Theodore Roosevelt. Like, back in 1890, when he's inking a deal to write a memoir about his time in the Dakota Badlands, he was talking to the publisher himself. Like, I would talk to Max. Yeah. And that guy, you think of it in context now of like, oh, Putnam was actually a person who was alive once who just had this little printing press house,
Right.
Max does the editing in-house and does all, and he has his own publishing thing. It's the same thing, Yeah, and I find it fascinating because that was for a few years like this huge war or a would-be war of like, self-publishers versus the gatekeepers. And I'm like, there is no fucking gatekeeper. It's who you know and how much you're willing to fight for it.
Right. And how much you're willing to give up.
How much you're willing to give up. What are the terms of battle? Where the battle's going to happen. It's all a series of decisions you and other parties have to agree to.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, now that we've been doing this for like an hour and a half, you have a new book coming out, huh?
I do. I have a book coming out September 14th. Or whenever this premieres, it's out now. I don't know when this is coming out. Yes, I have a new book called Standalone.
Nice. What's the new book about?
Oh, thank you for asking. Standalone is what if all the slasher killers you've ever watched a movie about, what if really there is a reason for them? Essentially, Standalone is about 4 guys who jump from dimension to dimension, versions of Earth, and commit heinous, violent crimes, laying waste to teenagers and unlucky travelers and ghost hunting television crews aplenty. But they do it because if they didn't, all of existence would wink out. They are the custodians of existence. They maintain the balance of all existence until something throws a monkey wrench into the whole process, and now they are being hunted. And they have to figure out what it is, because if they fail, then all of existence winks out.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was it. I was talking with someone else, and they're like, that's a bit of a big idea. And I'm like, that was me literally just trying to figure out how I can make a bad guy into a good guy without making him like a bad guy.
Right.
I said this earlier. I got the idea a few years back, and it percolated. And I remember thinking, I don't know what sparked it. I think it was because I was watching the movie Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. And if you haven't seen the movie, basically it presupposes a place where Freddy Krueger, Mike Myers, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, they're all real killers. And everything, all the supernatural stuff about them is just kind of urban legend, but they are real killers. And this one guy, Leslie Vernon, wants to join their ranks. So this documentary crew follows him around as he prepares to launch his legacy of his first killings. And I love the movie. It is one of my favorite movies. But even in that movie, they make the villain kind of into a character, a charismatic character, where you want to like him. He does bad things, but you want to like him. You want to kind of almost forget all the bad things. And I remember thinking, this is like 2015, 2016, maybe 2017, and I was like, but what if they're not charming? What if they are legitimately bad, but at the same time, because of circumstances, you have to root for them? Like, they're killing a lot of people and doing horrible shit, but it's a means to an end. Okay. In order to do that, whoever they're going against has to also be legitimately understandable and you have to be empathetic to them as well. How do you do it? And I was thinking about this the other day, and this book, the two authors that had the biggest influence on me as a writer are Jack Ketchum and Harlan Ellison. And if there was ever a story that for me married the two sensibilities, it's those two. Because I tend to write very not that I haven't written supernatural weird stuff. I once wrote a story about a living man-eating lake. I've written weird shit before, but I also tend, like my title novella, Bones Made to Be Broken, is about a woman's single mother dealing with a nervous breakdown and deals with mental illness. That tends to be where I go. Like, even when I have the supernatural shit, it's always very grounded in the real. You know, the one ghost story I've ever written is called Survivor's Debt. And I legitimately wrote the story from the perspective of a bystander who thinks his friend is going insane, while the friend thinks he is haunted by the people he served Vietnam with. And he feels compelled to do these various tasks to do it. And my narrator's just watching his best friend lose his fucking mind. I was kind of thinking that those kind of ways, like, what's the pathos, you know, kind of thing.
Right.
But in order to make the story work, I had to almost go bigger than life. I had to almost go like very fantastic with it. Adam Cesar, the writer of Clown in Cornfield and The Summer Job and Tribesman, he's a great writer. He was talking about the book, and he said, this is science fiction. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that's true. I can't argue with that. I wrote it as a horror novel, and I think of it as a horror novel, but it deals with quantum mechanics in a very layman's way, because I am not science-minded. And so, like, if someone said, it's science fiction, I can't argue with it. I think it's science fiction that a horror fan would appreciate. I think most science fiction fans would be like hardcore, like they've read all of John Scalzi, I guess, for lack of a better term, because that's the only science fiction writer I can think off the top of my head. Heinlein, who's read every Heinlein novel, would be like, this isn't science fiction. This is shit. Yeah. But it's science fiction for a horror fan, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Right. It's your event horizon.
Maybe. Wow, I'm going to use that. Actually, no, I can't, because fucking Paul W.S. Anderson. God damn it. Ruined fucking Resident Evil. Yeah, Standalone is the perfect marriage between Paul Thomas Anderson and Paul W.S. Anderson, but written by Paul Michael Anderson.
There you go.
It's Magnolia by way of Resident Evil Afterlife. Fucking hell.
We just did that.
Yeah, that's a thing that came out of my mouth.
But the book itself is filled with, like, with that in mind, has slasher tropes and a lot of pop culture references and sort of that stuff then mixed into this amalgam of sci-fi / horror.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it with an intent of it being a slasher. I see it as a horror slasher. I see it hopefully better than people would see movies like Pieces or Bloody Birthday, because those movies are dog shit. But it's not. I didn't write it to be meta like Scream or Behind the Mask, but I wanted to write it from the awareness of, hey, we all know slashers exist, because it was fun. It was a lot of fun. Within the first page, I have my main character driving a hatchet through someone's skull. I'm like, that's fun. But then I have that same main character absolutely destroyed and broken by the end of the story, and that's fun too.
Yeah.
I tried, and so I imagine it with that type of story, it might be very easy to throw a bunch of Easter eggs into it. And I really didn't. I kind of just focused on the story. The one Easter egg I threw in that I'm conscious of, I probably threw in more, but the one I come back to is one of the kills in the novel. there's one of the deaths in one of the Friday the 13th. I forget which one because there's been a bazillion of them. But Jason takes a guy who's in a sleeping bag and swings him around and like literally slams him the body into a tree trunk, and you just hear the splat inside. And you can just imagine how just like destroyed the body is inside the bag. So I made sure I included that because that was always the most gnarly death to me. I was like, oh my god, because they don't.
Nice.
I'm trying to remember. And I saw it when I was a kid. I can't remember if they actually show the broken body. I think they probably just show like a stunned dead face so you know the guy's dead, but they don't show like the damage done within the bag. I always thought that was so fucking gnarly.
Well, because that's the safest place, right? You get underneath the covers and then the monsters can't get you.
And then the monster got you. So I included that in there. But it was like I said, I think of it as a horror novel, but when Adam Caesar said it was like, this is science fiction, I'm like, yeah, I guess. Okay.
Yeah. Well, world jumping, I guess you get that, multiverse, like say quantum mechanics stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, any self-respecting sci-fi fan who is like, I am a science fiction aficionado would probably look at this and like, the fuck you think you're doing? And I'd be like, I don't know, man. Don't just like the book. Because like I said, but I had to think of a way that its own interior logic made sense to me, and that was the way I made it work. Like, okay, I have these bad guys, but I want to make them the main characters of my story, but I don't want to make them charming.
Right.
How do I do that? How do I make them empathetic and still bad? Because like in something like Scream, no one ever remembers the main character's name, the killer's name. They know him as Ghostface, maybe. Or in Behind the Mask, Leslie Vernon, he's still a villain. You like him for the first 2/3 of the movie, but when he becomes a villain, and he has to be put down. You don't be like, oh, I hope he makes it. No, you want to be put down.
Yeah.
So I had to make my slasher killers like, you hope they don't get put down. And that's a really weird sentence to say, but that's the way. That was my motivation. Okay, I need to make these guys evil. But I need you to root for them. How do I do? Again,
in the end, they save us all.
Yeah, purely by accident. You were asking earlier if I outline or if I, kind of pants it. No, that is a perfect example of me just figuring it out as I wrote it. Because when I first came up with the idea, I'm asking people, have you heard of this? Because this sounds like something that has to exist already. And people are like, no. I was literally working at like, okay, how can I do this? And I'll write like this and I'll write like that. But it also led me to writing myself into corners. Like, okay, I need to move this here and I need to put this here and I'm going to need this character here as I'm writing it, Yeah,
yeah.
The most Easter eggs, like in a story like that, like I said, it feels like it's prone to Easter eggs. There's a pre-order going with the book, like the first 350 pre-orders. They'll get a set of trading cards. I think we're roughly the same age. Do you remember back in the 90s, Marvel Comics used to put out trading cards of their characters?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When Max and the publishing house came to me and was like, well, what kind of little nifty thing can we do with this? I was like, what if we did trading cards of like various slasher killers that are used within the story or referenced within the story? And they're like, we could do that. So like I had to then come up with the backstories of all these slasher killers, and I just filled it full of like Easter eggs. I used the body count of all the Nightmare on Elm Streets for one of my characters just because it was easier than just making up a number. I used the pseudonym of a friend of mine as the actor who played one of the slash killers in one of the other movies, and I was like, all right, I didn't do Easter eggs anywhere else. I'm going to do a ton of Easter eggs here.
That's cool. Yeah, I have my order in, so I'm looking forward to getting the cards.
And
the book.
Oh, I hope. I got my cards. They sent me a set of the cards, and I'm like, I have my own trading cards. This is almost better than writing the book.
You're right. You gotta get a little frame, a little shadow box or something.
All right. Fuck the book. I got cards.
No, even the book, like they really, Max and Perpetual Motion Machine, Lori too. He runs it with her. They really went like my book plate looks like those old mom and pop movie rental store video cards, like membership cards, and I was like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So I got to sign a bunch of movie rental store cards.
Cool. Very cool. And you also, there's a companion story that's available as well.
Yes.
That goes along with this.
About halfway through writing the book, I realized, like I said, there's a lot of ideas going on there. It's a whole thing. And since I tend to write from the perspective of the character trying to figure things out, like I can't have him just suddenly knowing all these things. I had to have someone there who would understand what's going on. So a few years back, right after Bones Are Made, my first book came out, that when your first book comes out, that's when people start inviting you to things like, hey, would you like to write a story for this? And I'll be like, yes. How much are you paying? And and they'd be like, this much. I'll be like, I can do that. Someone, Eddie Generous, who runs Unnerving. He runs Unnerving Magazine and then Unnerving Publishing, I guess. Unnerving Press or whatever it's called. He was like, hey, I would really love to run a story about you. I was like, cool. And he's like, what do you have? I was like, I have this story about a guy who wishes that his daughter never feels any pain, so he feels all the pain she would go through in life. And I thought, and he was, and because my daughter was 4 or 5 at the time, 6 at the time, because it was 2017. So that was where my head was at. So he's like, cool, write it. And so I wrote this story called The One Thing I Wish for You, about a father who, when asked, like, hey, what this new father, he's like, if you could take away all your daughter's pain, but you would feel it, would you do it? And he does it. And the guy who gives him that wish is this guy in a black suit. And I don't really give him a name, but he's otherworldly. He's, he's not from around here. And I was like, hey, I could put him in the book. He would know what's going on, but not quite. So there's another story I wrote, and I actually just put the guys over at Ink Heist just put it up. It's called Everything Feels Wrong Without You. This is not a bonus story in the book, but it's related. And it's about a guy who keeps repeating the same hour, but it's a different type of reality. Like things are subtly changed, and he's vaguely aware that things aren't the way they used to be until he becomes aware that until he realizes that his best friend, who's a film archivist, is actually the guardian of every single decision in life you will ever make. And basically, it's another quantum mechanics type thing. His friend Marty is in charge. He is the guardian of all decisions everyone ever will make. The life you lived because you had a roast beef sandwich on Tuesday, and the life you lived if you had a turkey sandwich on Tuesday. And I realized I had these two characters from these stories, and I'm like, oh, they could serve as like anchors. So I put them in the story, and it took off because that barreled my main character into the climax. But when Max was accepting the novella, I was like, all right, I like these characters, and I want people to know where they come from because I brought them back. I've never done that before with other stories. I was like, hey, can we run this one story? Because it's the older of the two. And he was like, yeah, sure. And I was like, yay, because it was one of the first stories I wrote after Bones Are Made Broken was published. And I was really pleased with it because I hadn't written about fathers very often. I hadn't written about fathers at all up until that point. Despite being a father, I'd written about moms and just being a parent in general because I was raised by a single mom. So it was my first story of writing as from a dad's perspective, and I really liked it. So I was like, I want people to see this so they can see that, hey, my character shows up in other places. Plus, it made the book a little bigger.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. And where can they find that companion story?
The original story originally appeared in Unnerving number 3, Unnerving Magazine number 3.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other story, it's not a companion story. Well, if things work out the way I think they're going to work out, it might be a companion story to another edition.
the other story is called Everything Feels Wrong Without You, which you can read for free right now over at Ink Heist.
Nice. Cool. Very cool. I think that's actually where I saw it. Or it must have been.
Yeah, that's one of the two characters that kind of make an appearance in Standalone. They're like supporting characters, but they kind of serve as an anchor to make things make sense for everyone.
Sure. Cool. Very cool. Well, I am excitedly looking forward to getting your book. I just finished a mammoth tome. Took me like 2 months to read, 3 months to read. So I am free. I'm actually looking at I got ordered a Call of Cthulhu Dark Ages manual. So I've been perusing that as we may play a couple of games of that. But I'm looking forward to delving into some new stuff.
Excellent, man. Hope you like it.
Yeah. I expect that I shall.
Well, good. Damn it.
There'll be links in the show notes for everything. We'll have links out to your stuff, your blog, and all that stuff. But is there anything else that you want to throw out? Anything else you want to promote? Anything else that's going on before we cut you loose?
I can't think of anything, but that's because I've been working all day, so I'm a little fried. Trying to think. Book coming out. No, because all the other stuff that's going to be coming out, it's not going to be coming out for like a year. So like it's too early to promote that shit. Hey, remember this anthology? I'll be out in 2021. No one cares.
Right. Right. Well, we can maybe promote that you're going to be at Necronomicon in 2020. 2021.
I have not been officially invited, so I don't know. People have, like I said, people have threatened to be like, "We're going to have you there." I'm like, okay, I don't know. I don't. It always feels weird when I do stuff like that. If we do cons next year, I know I'll be at Scares of Care. I know I'll be at Nikon, and I know I'll be at Confluence. I don't know about anything else.
Cool. Well, if people are in those areas and those cons are local, you can take your new book, Standalone. You can go and have it signed.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a pre-order, you'll probably already have a signed copy, but, whatevs.
I mean, you get it signed in person. I don't know. You sign the other side.
Well, it's funny because I have a book by John Skip. He was one of the original Splatterpunks, and I have a book of his called The Long Last Call. It's a limited edition hardcover, and he signed it twice for me.
Nice.
And I've told him every time we meet up and hang out, I'm gonna have him sign the book again, so I look forward to having that book signed 5 times.
It's funny you say that. I was at I met Charles DeLint a couple of years ago. There was a big there's Tucson Festival books they do every year, and he was here. And I was like, oh, fantastic! I have to go. So I went. I stood in line. I talked to him for a little while. We went out to lunch. And there was a woman who was there, and she brought a book. I don't remember which one it was. It doesn't really matter. But every time she sees him, she brings the book, and he signs it and dates it. So she had 5 or 6 signatures of him from all these different years. So I thought, oh, that's pretty cool.
That is really cool.
Yeah, I never thought that. I'm like, shit, how many books can I bring, and he's not going to be mad,
Yeah, right.
And when I was at Necro last year, I brought a couple of books with me, but I'm like, shit, I'm going to buy a bunch of books while I'm here. I don't want to bring an empty suitcase to a convention. I don't want to be that guy, but jeez, I got to bring some of this stuff.
Oh no, when I'm at cons, when I go Scares of Care, I go with the deliberate intent of buying books. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. Last year, it was last year. I think I bought 13, 14 books. Because as I save up for it, I'm gonna put some money aside. This is my spending cash. I'm gonna go have some fun. Mm-hmm. Plus, it's nothing else. Especially if the authors are there, that money's going directly to the author. Exactly. You don't have to worry about royalty cuts and things like that, or revenue channels or stuff like that. It's, hey, $15. There you go, $15 in that author's pocket. So I always love doing that.
Yeah. No, that's the best. And then if you're lucky, you go out and you grab a beer after.
Yeah. I did that my first year at Scares. This is I think it was 2017 actually. And I knew a few people. I knew John Bowden, Jacob Haddon, things like that. But I didn't know many people. I knew of people. Joe Lansdale was there that year. John Skip was there that year. Wrath James White was there that year. And I was just hanging out, walking by, and I was talking with Skip, and he was like, I'm hungry. You want to go out to lunch? And so we all went out to lunch. And I was like, this is bizarre.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
And
that's definitely cool.
And you know, if you've ever seen Wrath James White, he's an extreme horror writer, but he's also 6'7",
Oh, jeez.
and he's a former prize fighter. And I got him, John Skip, and this author named S.G. Murphy in my little Pontiac. I was driving a Pontiac Vibe at the time, and I was just like, how? And
Ass dragging on the ground.
I think we strapped Skip to the roof, like Mike Huckabee's dog.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely cool. Well, I hope you're able to make it out. I hope you get that invite and we get to hang out and grab a beer at Necro. But if not, this was a blast. I'm so glad that you came on. I had it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, man, it was great. Thanks for having me on, John.
Absolutely. And when the book comes out, in a year or so from now, look me up.
All right then.
Cool. I want to thank everybody for checking this out, and we'll catch you next time. And now I was trying to figure out how to get out of here.